Welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. This week we're going to be painting a bird, a hawk, a Harris hawk, photographed by Denise McQuillan. And she put her photograph on the Facebook page, free reference photos for artists. So thank you, Denise. Beautiful photo and quite challenging, and a little bit bigger piece of paper this week. So I hope you have your reference picture ready to go, and let's start painting. I started the recording. So here we are with the drawing, and we are going to start with, I'm going to start on dry paper, so we don't need to wet anything. And we're going to have some bright yellow around the beak and around the eye. And we're going to paint the iris with the yellow too, because we're going to have those layers that shine through the eye to give it color. And I'm going to use Azo Yellow, but you can use cadmium yellow or just, a bright yellow. And then I'm going to use some Gamboge, which is a more orangey yellow, on some of the more orangey parts. And again, if you don't have Gamboge, you can mix a bit of red with your yellow to make it orangey, or a bit of burnt sienna with it. I've got both my color pictures in front of me. I'm going to start off with my number 8 brush and mix up my yellow. So I'm going to get my palette and some clean water. And this is my Azo Yellow. And right here, I'm going to put a little bit of Gamboge ready to switch to that. So the Gamboge is this one. It's pretty orangey yellow. And I have some red here. I'm going to mix some Azo Yellow with that red to make a more orangey color. And I'm also going to mix a little bit of burnt sienna with that. So I have a kind of an orangey brown for any areas that kind of need that orangey brown color. I may not have put that in my notes, but I'm just thinking it might be a useful mix to have.
Are you going with rose or
Well, I think if I was mixing an orangey yellow for this bird, I would use a cadmium red to make an orangey yellow, or a cadmium red and a burnt sienna. Now, this one I mixed here was a cadmium red, Azo Yellow, and a burnt sienna, and it gave me a really kind of nice, transparent, orangey browny color, which is, I think, for this bird, we'll stick to that palette of bright yellows, burnt sienna, the browns, and the grays, and not so much rose this week.
okay?
Yeah, I think when I made the very light gray, I used cobalt blue and burnt sienna. So I'm kind of using the burnt sienna and the yellow just for my warm colors. Oh, that should work. Now we can start really light. I have my number 8 brush. So I've got a big brush. I'm going to start pretty light. And again, direct painting on dry paper, we can put in all the areas where you see the yellow on the photograph. It's good to have a color copy or the photograph in front of you. Now, when you're coming up here, let's zoom in a bit. When you're coming up here near the feathers, where they're going to come into the head here, kind of flick your brush upwards. So you have the start of that feathery look here, because you're going to bring the gray feathers into the yellow skin. Now, obviously on this bird, the skin around the eye and the skin around the beak are this yellow color. So what you're seeing is skin with no feathers on. So I'm going around the iris. I just have Azo Yellow on my brush at the moment. And really, even if I make a mistake and put this yellow somewhere where there should be brown or gray feathers, that doesn't even really matter, because I can go over the top with the brown or the gray if I make a mistake. Just need to be careful that the only place I mustn't go over is the beak that is very light gray. There is a slight tinge on the photograph. It's a slight tinge of yellow here, just like there. Could be a reflection, but that's nice to have. This fold in the beak here is yellow. And it goes to sort of white skin as you come back here. So again, I'm going to flick the point of my brush so that I have that skin coming into feather here. And under here, I'm still with just my Azo Yellow at the moment. There's the bottom of the beak here. And again, I'm going to just flick my brush with the point here, just back into where the feather area is. And you'll see I have some little light places that I haven't painted. That's kind of nice. It's little highlights in the skin. And you can see it because I have the camera up really close, but when you pull back, you don't really see that. You just get that feeling of a little bit of sparkle or a bit of highlight on the skin. Now I'm going to switch to a smaller brush because I want to put a little bit of the Gamboge, the darker. And you don't have to rush with this because this is quite wet. So I don't want to put the Gamboge in quite yet because it will flood too much. I want it to stay. So you just keep painting at your own pace. Now where I see, the main place I see the darker Gamboge color. See, mine is all still quite flooding. That's what I mean. It's flooding too much, a little bit too wet still. So I have to wait. I'll bring the photo over. So the place I see the Gamboge is, or even the sort of burnt sienna color, I'm just going to paint a little bit of the burnt sienna color on there, is along this edge of the fold of skin, a little bit under here, and the nostril here. There's a little bit of the very light yellow poking out, and then it gets darker in here. Also, I have put in here, I have put a bit of Gamboge just to give this a little bit more dimension. Now, I think when this photo was taken by Denise McQuillan, who took the photo and posted it to the Facebook group, I think this was a captive Harris hawk her friend owned, and it was probably in a cage. Oh. And she may have used light or a flash. So it would be a little bit washed out and you wouldn't see as much depth to the face. So that's why I added a little bit more depth with some of the color. I don't think you could get a beautiful close-up photo. I'm pretty sure she mentioned that this was her friend's hawk. He trains hawks, and she took beautiful photos of them. So where I added a little bit of depth to see if I think mine's soaked in a bit. I added a little bit of depth around the eye here where it recedes in. And definitely inside the nostril. And that fold under the beak. And a little bit under here. And maybe a little bit more on the top, just to make it stand out. And if you find yours is too wet, just wait. You can put this in at any time. Do a little bit, tiny bit, just on the beak. Sometimes I add artistic touches that are not in the photo just because I want to add my stamp on it, my little artistic take on it. Also around the edge of the skin on the eye, just there. I've used a little bit of that when I put some burnt sienna in. Now, the nice thing is working on dry paper, we can sort of keep working without having to stop and dry for quite a while. And the beak is already dry, so we can work on the beak without having to stop. And I want to leave a lot of the beak white, even though in real life it may be gray, and even though the flash may have washed it out white, I think it's going to look dramatic in our painting. So particularly here, I want to leave that just white paper and just focus on putting a little bit of gray here, leaving some of these white splotches, so it's kind of splotchy gray. And again, it's better to go too light to start with and then have to add a little bit of dark later than go too dark to start with. So this gray is going to be Cobalt Blue and Burnt Sienna. Now let's bring my tray over. Get a clean spot. And if you ever want a soft gray, Cobalt Blue is a lovely soft blue. Make a soft gray. And then the Burnt Sienna acts like an orange because it's an orangey brown. So blue and orange make gray. I'm going to add a little bit at a time till I get a very soft gray. And of course, a lot of water. And I think I go back and forth, a little bit of Burnt Sienna, a little bit of Cobalt Blue until I get just exactly what I want. Lovely granulating, actually. The Burnt Sienna's granulating in it, and that will give us a little bit of variety. Number 4 brush. Don't want to go too small, but I definitely don't want a big brush because I want some control. And I'm going to stick the photo in front of me. So I'm going to start with the darkest part, which is close to the point of the beak. I've already got the blotch on there. I'm going to start down here, point of my brush and point of the beak here. And I'm going to go very carefully with the point of my brush, not painting fully, but trying to leave those little patches of white showing. And following the curve of the beak. Now, just on the edge here, I'm going to get some just burnt sienna, just a touch on the top of my brush. And I just want to put a little bit, really little bit of burnt sienna here. It's going to blend into the gray, wet in wet. I just want to put that tiny, tiny touch there. Go back to my gray mix. And while that burnt sienna is wet there, I want to go right alongside it, not over the top, but just right alongside, and let the gray blend wet in wet with it. And I'm leaving places with no paint. Now, as I come up the beak towards the curve, I'm adding a little tiny bit of Cobalt Blue to my mix and a little bit of water, because I want to water it down and blue it down a little bit as I come up here. So it's a little bit more blue. Then just cleaning my brush, just water on my brush. And I'm going to take that water and just soften that edge as I come up to the white part of the beak where I want it to be more white. Now this part's going to look kind of dark to you at the moment, but it's not soaked in, it's not dried. So don't worry about that. I have a little bit of that Cobalt Blue and water on my brush. And I'm going to put a little bit of shadow right up next here to the yellow. Again, wet brush. Just soften that in a little bit here. Maybe a little bit more coming up here. And now we've got that done, we have to look at the lower beak. And there is quite a dark shadow. So I want, my mixture's got quite diluted. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit darker again. A little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of cobalt blue. Get it a little bit darker again because I diluted it down. And this part of the beak is a little bit darker than the top. We're going to put more shadow on the bottom of the beak later. We can't do it all at once. We have to do it in steps. So wet brush, wetting my brush, just tapping a little bit of the water off and just softening that edge. And under here, you can't hardly see it in the photo, but under here is a little bit of very dark, either skin or beak. I think it's a little bit of skin maybe where they can hold the prey that they catch. That has a burnt sienna touch, but we won't put that burnt sienna in right now. We're going to put it in a second layer. There's also a shadow here where the top beak crosses the bottom beak. Here. Now, if your yellow is dry enough, and test it with this brush stroke, if it goes up here and is sitting on top of the yellow perfectly without blending in, then it's dry enough. And you can add a little bit more shadow. I'm darkening my mix again, a little bit more blue, a little bit more burnt sienna, just to get it a little bit darker. And there's a little tiny shadow in here. Now there's going to have to be a lot more shadow on the underside of the beak here, but we can't put it in wet and wet. We have to put it in a second layer. There's also shadow inside the nose. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to my mix to make a browner gray. And see that orange I made over there? I'm going to take a little bit of that, because inside the nostril, I want my number 2 brush. Inside the nostril is pretty dark. And we may have to do that in 2 layers, because sometimes it looks dark enough with the first layer and then it dries and you realize, no, you need it a little bit darker. I'm just going to put this shadow in first. Now there's another shadow over the top of the nostril. I'm going to use the orangey brown for that, just here. So a little bit of orangey brown in here. And again, this is not enough. This is not enough darkness for the full nostril. We're going to have to do that in a second layer, but that's at least the first layer of dark where the nostril is. I've left the light yellow showing, and I'm taking my wet brush and I'm just softening the edge of that. I'm softening it up with my wet brush. Now, this is sort of what I meant at the start, is sometimes it's much, much easier to be painting completely directly on dry paper. There's none of that worry about wet and wet. Where's the paint going to go? You kind of know exactly where your paint's going to go and you control it, which is an easier way to paint. I'll let you catch up with that while I look at my notes and just check where I went next. When we switch to the wet and wet for the neck feathers, you definitely want to switch to a bigger brush. It's easier to work wet and wet with a bigger brush. So I'm going to wet with a size 10. And I don't want to wet the yellow. I'm just going to wet the top of the head here. Bring it down a little bit. Make sure you've got good view. I'm also going to wet the neck area. And we're going to do these feathers in layers. It's not going to be all done at once. And that makes it easier as well, because you can think about each layer separately. You don't have to give your mind over to several colors at once. Our first layer is going to be using just that lovely light gray to put in some of the light gray areas. So I'm going to mix a little bit more cobalt blue with the gray again. I kind of browned it up a little bit, so I want to get it back to a very silvery gray. And I'm going to start just on the top of the head. And it's nice to be wet and wet because it's going to keep it lovely and light. And if you want to, you can skip a few areas where the feathers are reflecting light. But you'd be surprised, once you get the dark feathers on, the light gray will look very white. I'm going to come across the top of the head. Now follow, all the time when you're brushing, follow the direction of the feathers. And if you have the photo or painting I did in front of you, you can kind of see the direction of the feathers quite easily. I'm leaving a little bit, tiny bit of white showing. As they come back from the eye, the feathers kind of come up and sweep around. And as they come back from the eye, they're a little bit more burnt sienna colored. So I'm going to have to go back to my burnt sienna and add a little bit over this side of my gray, so I can switch back and forth from one to the other. And as I come from the back of the eye here, I want to sweep in some burnt sienna. And again, using the tip of my brush to make the kind of feather wave shapes. You come back from here. Now we're going to put some darker gray on top of this, but what you'll always see is the light gray and the burnt sienna underneath the darker gray that you'll put in afterwards. A little bit more burnt sienna on my brush, and the top is still slightly wet. So I'm going to put just a few little streaks of burnt sienna. There's more at the back of the head here, so I'm going to get a little bit more at the back of the head. It's quite light around the face, and it's quite dark under the sort of chin, and what you call it on birds some of the time, under the beak, under the chin. And you don't see a lot of the burnt sienna under here, but it's going to give us a lovely glow underneath when we put the dark gray feathers in. So take your time, you know, go slowly if you want to. I'm now cleaning my brush, wetting my brush, and I'm just going to use a wet brush to pull these feathers down and into the flow of the feather pattern. Where my neck goes right off the tape here, I'm just going to take a very, very, very diluted burnt sienna and just pull that down to the tape so that I have an edge. Definitely want to have some kind of an edge to my bird there. I don't want it to just stop before the edge of the paper. I still have my number 10 brush. I was just working with the point there. And I just got a little bit more of the burnt sienna and the blue. And same thing, I want to take it out to the tape. I'm going back to the gray. Take it out to the tape. Now this is all going to have much darker feathers on. So this is your under layer. Because when you put your darker feathers on, you want some kind of color underneath them. If you just have white underneath them, it's going to look very patchy and unrealistic. Again, this is my number 10 brush, but as I lift it up to just the point, I can get some quite thin feathery lines. Just remember, we're doing a painting and it does not have to be photorealistic. It can be more about the brush strokes and the colors. As long as we have some semblance of what we're painting, we can do artistic things with the brush strokes and the colors. That's fine. I'm going to grab a Kleenex. And I just want to going to just lift a little bit of this here, just lighten it up just slightly. I know it will dry a lot lighter. I just want to make sure that that area is good and light. Now that's all wet, so of course we can't do our second layer there, but we can start on the iris. So I'm going to give you a minute because I know you'll need some time to work on these wet and wet feathers. I have muted you because I was getting a little bit of background feed. So if you want to talk to me, just unmute yourself. And I don't know if you know, but if you have a laptop, I don't know what you're watching on. If you just press the space bar, you can temporarily unmute to speak without having to do the menu. But if you have an iPad, of course, you'll have to just press the unmute. So I'm looking at the eye and I can see a lot of burnt sienna in that eye. So that's one of the main colors that we're going to be thinking about using when we get to the eye. And we are just going to start with pure burnt sienna when we get to the iris. Okay, right. I'm gonna move on to the iris. So we just want burnt sienna, and make sure that your yellow is dry enough that you can paint on it. I'm going to do the eye in several stages. That's what makes it look realistic. You can't do it all in one stage. So my hand's in. Be very careful because I'm finding to do my iris, I need to rest my hand on my paper, and of course I can't because it's wet with the feathers. So I'm gonna grab a Kleenex for here to rest my hand and try not to get it in my wet feathers. So be aware of that. You might want to turn yours around so you can get to the iris without getting your hand in the wet paint. Now there are going to be shadows on the eye, and you know what you can do? Even though your pupil is going to be much darker, you can still paint it with the burnt sienna, because when you come in to do the darker area of the pupil, the burnt sienna background is going to give it some depth of color, some, darkness. As long as you can still see your pencil line, that's good. And nothing looks right until you get the finishing touches on. It's all about the layers, and you have to just trust that it's going to look okay when all the layers are on. I'm using my number 2 brush, so I've got lots of control. That. Now, what I want to do with a little bit of that burnt sienna is use a thirsty brush, which means I wash and clean and dry my brush. And I'm going to come out and I'm going to just take a few highlights coming out from the pupil. Because if you look at the photograph, there are some very light yellowy highlights. That's why we have the yellow underneath. When we pull some of these highlights out, you don't have white paper showing you've got the yellow, the warm highlights. There are also some that kind of go in a round direction like this. I don't want to do too much, just enough to show that the eye has some muscles and reflection in it, just enough. And it's not going to look great yet because I don't have the pupil in. And I need that part of the eye to dry before we can go on and do any more to the eye. But there's lots of other places we can work on while that's drying. We can take that gamboge and a little bit of the brown color, and we can put that shadow in on the beak that I couldn't get in just now because it was too wet. It's dried quite a bit now, so I can add a little bit of that in, give that some three-dimensional look. Same with the crease in the beak. You can mainly see it because of my pencil line, but I can also go over that with a little bit of the gamboge. Give it a little bit more distinction. And another place I want to put some gamboge is underneath, more shadow. A little bit more in here. And in here. I'm putting gamboge in here, but I'm going to come back with a little bit of brown and add some more shadow. Oops. Taking the gamboge over either side of that little part in the nostril so that it's going to make the little part of yellow that peeps out more dramatic. A little bit around the edge of the eye skin where it meets the feathers. A little bit on this edge here. And coming down here. This is all shading that's underneath, going to be underneath the feathers. A little bit on the top. And I'm overemphasizing what I see in the photo. I feel that the bottom of my beak is too light. So too light compared to the top. So I want to take a little bit of cobalt blue with the gray. Very, very watery indeed. I'm going to just take that white down a tiny bit with a little bit of cobalt bluey gray. It'll make the top beak brighter, and this one won't stick out so badly. It looks like it's sticking out. Tiny bit of gray on there. And now I'm pretty much at a stage where I'm going to have to dry the painting before I can carry on. I want to let this just soak in a little bit. And then I tell you what I can do before I do that, before I dry. I'm going to take a little bit more of the browny gray. And while this light gray that I just put on is wet, it's a good time to just add a little bit more under here. It's quite dark under the beak. I put a little bit of that gray in. Now I've got a little bit of burnt sienna. Let the two mix wet and wet. Tip of my brush to just blend them in. I'm not finished with this underbeak yet. When this is dry, I'm still going to add shadow on this edge. But it's a good time to add that shadow underneath. Maybe a tiny bit. Maybe a tiny bit here. No, I don't know. Yeah, the only thing I'm a little worried about is it soaking in too much because it's wet, but I can add a little bit of shadow there and it'll be fine. And I can do a little bit more when this is dry. It's the thing you're always having to gauge with watercolor. How wet is my paint and what can I do right now and what shouldn't I do right now? Easy to get impatient and want to do more than you really should. That was borderline there. Not quite sure if I should have done it, but add a little bit of shadow under there. I'm just searching for things I can do before I stop and dry. Quite like that little bit of shadow just along the under edge of the beak there. And again, I've done a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to that too. Just there. Burnt sienna with either cobalt blue or ultramarine blue work really, really well together, wet and wet. And two lovely colors for gray especially. Right, so I am going to mute so I don't blast you with the hairdryer and dry my hawk. Now I used a low speed on my hairdryer. I don't want to shrink it too fast, but I do want to continue working on the eye so that we get some sense of how the eye is going to look and how dark the eye is going to be, because that really helps you know how dark to go with the feathers when you get your dark sin on the eye. So we want to do the iris. I mean the pupil, I'm sorry. We want to do the pupil and we want it really nice and dark. So to get it really nice and dark, I mix Payne's gray with some sepia and some Dioxazine Violet to really good transparent colors, really dark. Payne's gray is quite dark, but it's not going to be dark enough for a pupil in an eye when we want it really dark. And that's our background color too. So I have some dark over here. Actually, it's looking a little mucky, isn't it? I might clean it up a bit. I was using some violet the other day for my Christmas cards. Let's just clean that up a little bit and start with the Payne's gray. I'm doing what I never ever do in real life. I do not mix over the top of my painting because I'll splash paint on it. Only reason I'm doing this is so you can see under the camera what I'm doing with my paint. So don't do what I do. Don't lift your paint up over your painting. I'm incredibly messy and I tend to splash. So, and then I have some Dioxazine Violet. A bit more Payne's gray. You can see how rich and dark and yet fairly transparent those colors stay. A bit more Payne's gray. Payne's gray by a lot of manufacturers has ultramarine blue in it. So You can add a bit more ultramarine blue if you want, but usually the Payne's gray. I think the one I buy has ultramarine blue and black mixed in it to make Payne's gray. I've got my dark color for the pupil, and then I want my small number 2 brush. Not much water in your paint, otherwise it's not going to be dark enough. And then very carefully, you've got to make sure that your eye is completely dry. Otherwise, it's going to bleed into your burnt sienna. You won't get a nice sharp line for your pupil. Bring my photo over. That lovely, lovely dark color in. If yours is not coming out dark, then you need to add more pigment, less water. That's the key to getting it dark. When I say less water, I don't mean dry, because if you look at my paint is good and wet. It runs around and it's wet when it goes on, but there's a lot less water mixed with the pigment. Make sure that's on there. Now there's a deep dark shadow across the eye. We can't put that in yet. We have to wait till this pupil is dry before we put that in, but we can put some other shadows in. I'm going to mix some of that pupil color that I just mixed. I'm going to mix it with the burnt sienna over here in my gray pile. A little bit of the cobalt blue, because what I want is a medium warm gray. The burnt sienna makes it warm, and that medium warm gray can be used for some of the detail around the eye. Now, around the edge of the eye, as a definite darker shadow. Now, you'll need a number 2 or a number 1 brush for this to get a nice thin line around the edge of the iris. And I'm going to use my damp brush to just soften that in places. I'm going to have a dark shadow across the top anyway. I don't want that to be too harsh all the way around. A little bit more water with that, and I'm going to have some shadow coming in here under that sort of eyebrow. Same thing. I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna. I want to warm that up a little bit. And bring a warm brownish gray down under the eyebrow. Now there's going to be all kinds of things happening with that eyebrow. There's going to be just showing you here, there's going to be feathers coming down here. I can put a few in now just to remind me of what's going to be happening, just to help me gauge how dark to go with things, because it always feels too dark when you first put it in. There's a temptation to go back and lighten it up because it feels too dark, but it's not going to feel too dark when you have some of the dark feathers in. Another place there's a lot of dark feathers is around the edge of the yellow here. Kind of fades to almost nothing, just right where I have the point of my brush now. It sort of fades away to nothing, and then it gets darker and darker, and the feathers kind of pull back from that area. So I'm doing the same thing with my brush, putting the dark in first, and these feathers that came down here, and then from that dark paint and the tip of my brush, I'm pulling them back in the direction that they go. It's kind of like putting mascara on. You have to do it gently. Don't clog up your lashes. Make this bird look very beautiful. And it can be done very slowly. point of your brush, a little bit at a time. Don't have to rush. You can come back and add more. This is just the beginning. Now, if I want to lighten up that color, I'm just going to add a little bit more water. So I've got my brush, a little bit more water here, pull it off to one side. And I've got a much, much lighter gray. I added a tiny bit of cobalt because there's a little bit of sort of gray shadow under here, but it's not as dark as around the eye. And there's feathers coming along here. And also coming in here under this eyebrowy area, there's shadow, but it's not solid. It's kind of like freckles almost. I've added a little bit of burnt sienna to my gray, and I'm putting those freckles in. They're going to have feathers and sort of eyelashes coming over the top of them. So they're going to be underneath here too. You're almost, well, I don't know if you're like me, but I always want to like rush ahead and get everything in, all of the dark feathers and all of the details. It's so hard to stop myself and say, no, you can't do that. You've got to be patient. You've got to wait and put all these little details in first. As a very dark shadow under here. Can darken that one up a little bit. All these little dark shadows, shapes, they make the hawk look a little bit more predatory, which of course it is. The eyebrows especially. Eagle-eyed is what they make it look. I guess it's called that for a reason. And under right here is a very dark shadow. I'm going to take that black that I got for the made for the pupil, and I'm going to just put a little bit in here. So it's very dark, just right there. And here we go back to this shadow that I tried to put in earlier, but I said it's too wet. A really dark shadow here. It can be a hard-edged, you don't need to soften it, shadow that comes under here. It's the shadow from the top beak. And it's really, really dark along here. I've mixed that pupil black with a little bit of the dark gray, and I'm adding much more dark shadow to this area. Slowly, 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 because I just want to make sure I put it all in the right place. Always coming back towards the direction of the feathers. The other place it's pretty dark, and I can go with one more layer, is just underneath this nostril shape here. And there's a little dark patch here. You can define the nostril a little bit more. Again, it needed those 3 layers to get the 3 layers of dark. So there's quite a lot going on. We have a lot more in the way of light gray freckles on the beak area. I've mixed a little bit more cobalt blue with my gray, watered it down a little bit so it's not so ultramarine now. And my number 2 brush, and I want to put a few more of these freckles in under here. what I tend to do is put them in harsh like that, then come back with a wet brush and soften them and squish them a little bit with a wet brush so that they're not quite so harsh and they're a little bit more spread out. Same with the burnt sienna ones. We've got a little bit more burnt sienna, softening them with a wet brush and just spreading them out a little bit. It's pretty delicate, delicate little freckles. There's a few. I'm getting just a gamboge on my brush now and adding a few little gamboge freckles. The edge of that eyebrow, a little bit of gamboge along the edge. Now my pupil is nearly dry and my iris is pretty dry. So I want to put a little bit more texture in before I put the deep shadow. My tape's popping up from the hairdryer. So I want to add some, I use sepia. You could use burnt umber, sepia, Van Dyke brown, and a little bit of burnt sienna. So some sepia, burnt sienna. Tiny brush again, number 1 or number 2. And there are a few sort of, be very delicate. There's a few sort of shaded areas in the iris. There's a darker brown towards the edge. There's some sort of like darker brown lines coming around. A few sort of coming out. A little bit more of the, it's not dark brown, it's just darker than the burnt sienna. Helps to give some life to the eye. And then for the deep shadow, to that brown I've just mixed, I'm going to add the cobalt blue and go back and add a little bit more sepia, a bit more burnt sienna. Switch to my number 4 brush, so I'm not too delicate with this shadow. And don't paint out the reflection. Don't lose the reflection, but there's a shadow that goes right across the iris and sort of comes under the eyebrow there. And again, I'm taking it slowly so I kind of get it in the right place. I don't want it to be in the wrong place. It goes right under here. I might even need to do another layer. A little bit of a shadow here. I might, when that's dry, I think I might do just a little bit of cobalt blue over the top of that shadow to push it back a little bit further, but that's okay for now. I can work on the feathers around here while that is sort of settling in. Now I want a really good dark gray for those feathers. So I'm going to switch to my ultramarine blue and burnt sienna because that gives you a little bit of a stronger gray. Heavy on the ultramarine blue, so you get a lovely cool, very cool gray. And we want to go in with some of the darker feathers close to the eyebrow. And either use a number 4 or a number 2 brush. Use a brush that's small enough to control your brush strokes because you want to get that lovely feathery look around the eye. I've got my number 4, but I'm going to have my number 2 in my hand as well so that I can switch over for a little bit more delicacy. Some of these that I'd probably even switch to my liner brush in a minute. There's a little patch here of dark. I'm being very, very careful again. It's very, very direct painting, very carefully following the line of the feathers. I'm just going to get my number 6 brush. And sometimes I like to just use a wet brush to soften some of those lines and just make it look like watercolor rather than a photorealism. I've wetted and softened up to here. So I'm going to put that little dark area in that's here. And they kind of split there. And again, wet brush. I just want to soften this. I want to take some burnt sienna. I have some burnt sienna on my brush because I also want to, while this is wet and wet and wet again, I want to add that burnt sienna touch to what I'm doing, wet and wet, but with the control of starting on dry paper. And take a little bit of that burnt sienna down there. I'm going to go back with a wet brush and just soften these feathers in. Touch more burnt sienna to my mix, a little bit more burnt sienna for these eyebrows here. I would never consider doing this without having the photograph right in front of me. It is right here. So I can look carefully at the direction of the feathers and where they go and how dark they are. These ones here over like the eye are very dark. Quite a lot of blue. I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue to my mix because they're quite cool in color. And take them, pull them in back in the direction of the feathers over the eye. Yeah. Got a lot of brushes. I got 3 in this hand, and then I'm going to put the number 8 in this hand because I want the look to change from doing those very controlled feathers to now I have some feathers coming up here. Same color, same like ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, but I want these more loose, not quite so detailed and strong. And they're coming up here. They're kind of a little bit wavy. Again, I put them in, wet my brush, wash my brush, get a little bit of water on my brush, and then gently, very gently blend these feather strokes in. And some coming down the top of the head, some coming up the side of the head. Big brush now, got my number 8 brush in that hand. Feathers on, a little bit of water. Blend them in a little bit. This coming down here is stronger coming up here, but I don't want it too defined in every brush stroke. So start with defined and then blend it out a little bit. So I've got a combination of both. burnt sienna on my brush. I'm going to grab some burnt sienna. And I'm going to add to that mix, wet in wet, a little bit of burnt sienna. And sometimes it feels messy when you do it, and you just have to wait till it's dry. How many times have I said that? And then when it's dry, you may need to add a little bit more, add a little bit more dark, a little bit more detail. Now the other place it's really, really dark, let's grab this, is here. So it's very light in a kind of a triangle here. So let's keep that wet here in this triangle. And then let's put the dark in with the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Big brush. Then you won't be tempted to be too finicky with your brush strokes. And we're going to put that dark in. I've wet this area so that it doesn't get too detailed. And this is my second layer, not my final layer. This is where I'm starting to find the darks, quite dark under here. Find the darks and put the darks in. These kind of darks shape the head. As they come down the neck, it's not so dark on the neck. And if you have it wet, you're not going to get too many lines that don't blend. A bit dark under here, a few feathers showing. I'm going to get the cobalt blue, this cobalt for a moment. I want to just put some, if I put just cobalt over the top of these burnt sienna feathers that I put on, I'm going to get the burnt sienna showing through the cobalt, making a lovely glaze layer. And as I'm coming away from the head, I'm not going to pay so much attention to detail. Like I said, I want a watercolor. I don't want a photorealistic painting. Picking my brush up to just use the point to put in some very thin feathers. Now, while it's all still wet, I'm on my number 4 brush and my dark mix again, which is the burnt sienna and the ultramarine blue. And this is still wet, so I can still add a little bit of detail on top. I'll get that soft look. And I can still go in with some darker feathers. So there are quite a few darker ones around the beak here, but I'm going to take those very, very slowly. These bigger sort of wet in wet ones, I needed to do a little bit more quickly because wet in wet always needs to go a little bit faster. But then when you get to the more detailed ones, like around the beak here, you can slow down again. And it's good to have a combination of some quite dry brush strokes and then some lovely blended wet in wet brush strokes. All around here is not dark enough yet. It will definitely need a third layer. Even around the eye, you need a little bit more paint for sure. My sepia color. And around the eye, still quite dark around here. Quite a lot of detail. Now around the eye will look a little bit too dark because I haven't got the back of the head dark in yet, and I don't have any dark background. And of course you don't have to do the dark background if that seems a little bit too challenging. It definitely is the most challenging part, to very, very quickly get a dark background on that's nice and like even's what I'm looking for, because you do have to work kind of quickly to get it even. I'm just adding a little bit of water to blend some of the things in. And I don't think it's dry enough to do the blue layer under the eye yet. I definitely think I want to dry that. So while you're still working on yours, I'm going to use my hairdryer and try and get everything nice and dry so I can sort of work on a few of the finishing touches and show you how to do the background. I'm going to put a much darker shadow under the eye. Look at this one. I want to put a bit darker brown under the eye here and around the eye. I have to put all of these very thin feathers on with my liner brush. And then I want to put much more dark over here with more ultramarine blue, a gray that's more ultramarine blue and an ultramarine blue mix for that gray. So I've got a few steps to do. And I want both of these, I want the original photo and my painting in front of me to remind me what decisions I made along the way. And I did make them over 2 days. It took me 2 days to actually finish this when I did the original. So I came back the next day and realized I needed a lot more color in the feathers. And I do here too. They're very pale. They should be pale in places like here, definitely very pale, reflecting the light, but you need the darks as well. I'm going to start with the dark around the eye here. I'm going to use pretty much just ultramarine blue for that, because I don't want it to be a muddy shadow. I want it to be more transparent. And sometimes just adding ultramarine blue is enough to get a lovely deep shadow that's not muddy. Don't lose the highlight, Caroline. That's darkened it up. It makes the creature look a lot more eagle-eyed, hawk-eyed. And I think I need a bit more brown around the eye, and this eye socket here I think has some shadow. I think it needs to be browner here. Kind of a shadow right in the photo. There's a bit of a shadow on that eye socket there. Maybe a little bit of blue here for the freckles here. Blue shadow coming down here. Maybe even a little bit more blue on one side of the iris. Well, that's one area I wanted to address. Now, I think it's a good time to get my little tiny liner brush and do some of the very, very fine feathers, because that helps show me where I need extra detail. I'm going to mix some of my dark iris color. I've got my dark iris color and then my ultramarine blue and a bit of the burnt sienna. Got my 2/0 liner brush, and I have all of these. Got to sort of flick upwards with my brush. All of these, I think they're like an eyelash almost. They're less like feathers and more like eyelashes in shape and stiffness. So they come over the top of those freckles. So if your freckles that you made are looking a little bit weird, they'll look better when they have these details over the top. They're very, very thin, so you need a very thin line brush. I have to turn a little bit because I have to flick from my wrist outwards. And of course, there's lots under here too. And we won't be able to see them all because we're going to put a dark, well, I'm going to put a dark background on. You may not. So if you're not going to put a dark background on, you maybe want to put some of these in here too. There's quite a lot of just little, very sparse feathers or feathery type things happening around the beak. And at this point, I kind of like it when my brush is starting to run out of paint because I can get a lot finer line then, and I'm not so worried about having a line that's too dark. I had to dip in some more paints, and then I have to be very careful now again that I don't get these too dark. You can always, if you feel that, you can always take some of the paint off on a piece of scrap paper if you feel that you are going to have too much in the way of a dark line, thick line. And keep it on top of the head. Coming down here. Some of them cross over this line in the beak. They come right over the top. And of course, I'm getting a little bit of brown into the mix now, a little bit of burnt sienna color into the mix, because there's also some areas here that are dark patches of feather coming into the skin area. We can add a little bit of detail. Again, I'm going to get a little bit more burnt sienna into that brown gray color and use that to start doing some of the detail around the eye that I didn't want to do with the previous layer. I wanted a bit more wet in wet look. If ever your detail gets like too much, if you feel you've overdone it, you can just wait till it dries and go in all over the top with a bit of a wet in wet look, and you'll just dull it down just enough that it won't look too obvious if you feel it's too bitty or too detailed. Now there are some quite dark areas under here. Again, this brush is lovely for that because I'm rolling it in the paint, getting it full of paint, and then I can really just do very delicate brush strokes with it. And there are some places here where there's a definite area of dark feather showing against the light. Always in your reference photos, search for the darks and search for the lights. Search for the shapes that they make. What shape does the very lightest shapes make? What shape does the very darkest shapes make? And try and make those shapes first. And then you can sort of fill in with everything in between. And even if you've made those shapes and they're underneath the filling in, it doesn't matter. They're still there. They're still part of your painting and your observation. See, I'm going to put some in here, but I'm going to go over the top in just a minute with some more dark and some more ultramarine blue because I want it a bit more blue. Go to my teeny brush. Yeah. A bit of dark, teeny brush, a little bit dark. Add a little bit, there's also more shadow here from sort of the eyebrow coming across here. Across the eye. It'll look too obvious until it dries and then it will fade in. And I want to switch back to my number 8 brush, back to a bigger brush. And I want to go in for the more bluey colors on the neck. So I've got my ultramarine blue and put a little bit of burnt sienna in it. I grabbed a nice pile of ultramarine blue, a little bit of burnt sienna in there, but I don't want it too brown. I want to add some blue tones to this dark area. Might want it even a bit more blue. Bigger brush because I want to do some bigger shapes, bigger shadows. I want to fill in the darks I can see with big brush strokes. And I have to be bold. If I'm too delicate, too scared of what I'm doing, I'm not going to get any movement to my brush strokes. It's all going to be fiddly. I've got a clean wet brush now, and I'm just blue, just blending some of those strokes in with a wet brush. Cobalt blue, I'm going to get some cobalt blue on my brush. My big brush. And let's get some cobalt blue up here. I want a bit more blue in my picture and a bit more boldness, a bit more watercolor look going on. And when I have that ultramarine blue, because it mixes beautifully with burnt sienna, wet in wet, I'm just going to take some burnt sienna and get that in there too, wet in wet with my blue. Now my brush is just clean and wet. I'm just sort of blending it in a little bit. It will look kind of messy when it's wet. Don't worry about that. Cobalt blue again. And I don't want these big white light areas here. I want to take those down a notch. Some cobalt blue. I want to leave it light here because I want to put, I'm going to do a dark background. And that now will be your choice, whether you stay with this painting with a white background because you don't want to take the risk of the dark background, or do you want to put the dark background in? Totally up to you for the next stage. Still doing a little bit of dark feathering in here. And then I'm going to make sure, before I do the dark background, you've probably got a lot to do to catch up. I'm going to make sure this is dry around the edge so I don't have any bleeding of the dark background into the light paint. I'm just going to mute for a minute again. So for my dark background, I'm going to mix up a really dark color. And I can mix it on top of my pupil color because it's going to be some of the same colors. I have written down, just see what I've written down. And like I said, I did 2 layers. My first layer was too light, so I went back with a darker layer. And I decided to go with the violet so that it was a complement of the yellow in the beak. So my second layer was the Dioxazine Violet, Payne's Gray, and I used Prussian blue. It's a very cool blue. And you could use ultramarine. So I'm going to start with some Prussian. I think I had the ultramarine on the first layer and it was very granulated, and I didn't want to put granulated on top of granulation because that's when you can get mud. If you have a granulating color and then you put another one on the top, you can tend to get mud happening. So I didn't want that to happen. So this is my Prussian blue. And I'm going to add my Dioxazine Violet, which is a staining color, an intense color, very transparent though, which is what makes it so beautiful. And Payne's Gray just gets it nice and dark. I get some of that in, and it may not, one layer of this may not be dark enough. I may have to come back in with a second layer to get it dark. Now I need it. I don't want it very watery because it will be too light, but I don't want it dry either because I won't be able to get it to flow as I'm painting. So it's a delicate balance of having it wet enough to paint with, but not too much water that you lose your dark. And then you need a big brush. I got my number 10 brush now. And this area is a smaller area to start on. So I'm going to start with a smaller area so that if I start up here, I'm going to be getting dry paint against wet paint, and that's going to be difficult to manage. I'm going to start up against an area I want to keep nice and sharp. And these whiskers I did, of course, are not going to show up. I'm going to have to come back in with my white paint to get them to show up. And I have to be very careful not to let my paint dry as I'm working, because if it dries, I'm going to get lines where that happens. And so I've got to be quick. That's why I use a big brush. And don't fiddle. If you get a spot like I did there, you just like quickly wipe it in. Now I'm coming into this big area now, and I have to really, really work fast. So let's get this big area in quickly. I can come up against the beak in a minute. Let's get some of this in, and then I can come up very, very carefully against the beak. So I keep it lovely and crisp. What I want is that dark, dark against that crisp, crisp, light beak. Sorry, I'm going to have to turn it because there's no way I can paint this without turning the paper. And I have to keep loading my brush. Keep going back and loading my brush up with paint. And let's turn it around again. Put this on quick. The other thing you can't do is you can't go back over your brush strokes. Otherwise, you're going to get streaks. I cannot go back over any of these brush strokes. I'm maybe in that little corner there as I missed the corner, but I can't go back and paint this. Don't keep putting paint over paint. You can put a second layer over a dry first layer. That's fine. But don't put wet paint over wet paint. There's two things I needed to do before I started this was I had to mix up enough paint I can get through this without stopping. And I needed to put as little water as I could so that my paint would flow, but that I didn't have it too light. And then I needed to work fast. So it's like doing a background is a very, very tricky thing. That's why I said, make a decision whether you really want to do that, because it's not easy. And if it doesn't turn out dark enough, wait till this is dry. And what I'm doing here is I'm just cleaning up any wet that's on the tape, because wet paint on the tape will flow back and make backgrounds into your background wash. And if you see any areas, like I'm seeing this area is drying a bit too fast, and it will be a bit lighter, so it might mean that I need a second layer. Don't go back and fix it now. You can't do that. I've got a little spot here on I'm going to fix this little spot on the beak, but don't go back and try and fix this while everything else is still wet. You will get an unholy mess. It will be awful. It's way better to have something that's just drying a little bit light that hardly anybody's going to notice than a great big mess you make by going back in and trying to fix it while everything's wet. What you want to make sure of is that close to the head and the beak, you've got it nice and crisp and even, like the snow on when King Wenceslas looked out. And when this is dry, we can use some P.H. Martin's white to put in a few more of the whiskers that are showing up against the background. And I can see that mine is drying unevenly. It's drying quicker here than here, which is probably because I put it on a little bit too fast there. Should have slowed down a little bit, maybe even a bigger brush. I should have maybe even had a 12 brush to get this area in quickly. But it's okay. This one here, I put 2 layers, and this area granulated quite a bit, and it doesn't really affect the finished painting when all said and done. And because of that, I might put a second layer on. I might not. I might just leave it like that. So the only other step that I would do now is the little bit of white for the whiskers. And I don't want to dry this with a hairdryer yet, because when you get uneven drying, when some of it like this is drying and this is still wet, you can get a really odd look to your paint. Already I'm getting a little bit of an odd look here where it's drying a little bit faster than here. So I don't want to make that worse with the hairdryer. I just want to leave it for a little bit to settle in and make sure none of that bleeds back into the bird. And at this point, now I have that color on. I might even want to take a little bit of that color that I have in the background, and I might want to even just add a little bit of that color to the darker parts of the bird, just so I have some unity with the background color and the darks in the feathers. That's often a really lovely thing to do. And that's why you can walk away for a day and come back and make some decisions about things like that. And it works way better when your bird is completely dry and you put on another layer. It works way better than just being slightly dry or slightly damp still. So it's just that what I'm using is just that background color. I have the background color here. Just putting it on the darkest parts of the bird to tie it into the background. Give it a little bit more color. And now my background is starting to really, you can see it's going dull. It's really drying up quite a bit. Just so that I can finish with the little whiskers, I am going to dry just a little bit here. I wouldn't normally, like if you're doing this at home and you're watching the video, just leave it for a couple of hours. Just leave it to all settle in and dry properly by itself. But I'm just going to give it a quick whisk with the hairdryer just so I can put the white whiskers in to finish it. Okay, so we've got one more step, and that is just to put the little white whiskers on with a fine brush. And that's only if you do the background. If you don't do the background, you've probably got your whiskers on in a dark color. And of course, I use a very fine brush and the Dr. P.H. Martin's white, but you could also use white gouache. You could use a little white pen. If you have a white pen. You don't have to have the gouache, but I have some here on my brush. I have to be very, very careful to barely touch the paper or paint. And of course, use really clean water, because if you use dirty water in your white paint, it's going to go messy and gray. I'm going to take a little bit of the paint off so it's not too thick. And the thing is not to overdo this too. If you've lost any of the lights in your eye, you can put a little bit on with the white if you've lost any highlights. If you've lost any highlights in the feathers, say you've lost a little bit of the highlights on top of the head, you can go back with some white and put some in, or even some, just putting some so that you get that kind of feathery look across the edge of the background, so the background doesn't look so cut out and pasted on. Also here, this will help stop that background looking cut out. Here too, if you've lost any of these little things here, you can put those on. And anywhere that you feel you want a few little light feathers showing that you've maybe lost with having too much dark, you can add them. I think I need just a little bit of white under the eye here. There was just a little bit more white here. I maybe did it too yellow. And a few little white feathers. So anything like that. Also, again, I don't want this to look too cut out and pasted on here, so I can add a few little light feathers under here, just so that I have a soft soft edge to the bird rather than a cutout look. Put a light on the head. And we're just about, just about done. That was a very, very quick rendition. And I always like to take the tape off and see how it looks when you've got a nice clean edge. This one I did on 7-inch by 10-inch paper, Arsh 140-pound cold pressed. The reference photo was by Denise McQuillan. And that's on Facebook, free reference photos for artists. I did ask her permission. I did send her a photo of the painting. So there we are. That's today's one. There's the one I did a few weeks ago as a sample. I've used just a white pen to sign it with. And they're never going to be two the same. They're never going to look exactly the same. This background had 2 layers. I'm okay with 1 layer on this background. I'm even okay with the watercolory look. It's watercolor. I don't mind if it looks like watercolor for the look. So the other tools you can use are the watercolor pencils, which if you use a white one with a nice sharpened point, will give you a lovely sharp line. You can use a charcoal pencil, which will also, if you sharpen it nicely, will give you a lovely fine line. If you want white on your painting, you don't have to use the Dr. Martens pH white if you don't have it, if you can't afford it. Pencil like this just costs $2 or $3, and you can buy them individually. So you can buy a charcoal pencil, you can pastel pencil. I don't know if you can get the watercolor pencils individually, but you can definitely get the others. There's things like a Jelly Roll pen, white pen. I don't like them as much. They're a little bit thicker lines, so not as fine as a pencil or a paintbrush. And then there's the Posca pen. You have to shake them and push down on them, but you can get them in different widths. So this is a very fine one, and again it will give you a lovely fine line. So you don't have to have the paint. You can use a pencil, you can use a pen, or if you're not doing the dark background, you can use just a dark paint for the sort of feathery whiskers. So I hope your hawk turned out well and you enjoyed painting it. We'll see you again next time. Bye for now. Well, thank you for joining me again today. I hope you enjoyed painting the hawk and you were happy with your painting and how it turned out. See you again next time. Bye for now.